Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Our guest today is Dr. Matthew Lee. Matthew is a research associate at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard and a member of the Global Study of Human Flourishing research team. And our focus for today is the Global Flourishing Study, of which the first wave of data has just been published, and we discussed that with Matthew. Matthew's also Professor of the Social Sciences and Humanities at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University and a Distinguished Visiting Scholar of Health, Flourishing and Positive Psychology at Stony Brook University's Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care and Bioethics, as well as a Visiting Scholar at the Benson-Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital. He's co-editor of Measuring Wellbeing and Leadership for Flourishing, both published by Oxford University Press, as well as Transcending Crisis by Attending to Care, Emotions and Flourishing, published by Routledge. Nick, what did you enjoy most about our conversation with Matthew?
I think the highlights for me were the highlights of the study, right? Like kind of the main takeaways so far. And I want to be careful here, and I know you do too, and Matt was great about it, and that this is the first wave. Right. So we're looking at really interesting associations or correlations and effect sizes. And you and I both, I think, reacted to hearing about negative correlations between flourishing and things like GDP and individualism. Right. And we have to temper it for the moment because there's going to be additional waves, additional potential causal relationships that they can explore later on. So for me, it was just this really nice combination of excitement around these new findings from one of our lead sponsors, right? And this beautiful global study that's going to inform so much of what we do, while also being able to kind of stay excited about the additional nuance and details that are going to be coming up in waves 2 and 3 and beyond. And that will, of course, have Matt back on to chat about in future episodes.
Absolutely. Yep, it was a fascinating conversation, a huge amount to learn in this episode about a really important study on human flourishing. This is Early Lessons from the Global Flourishing Study with Dr. Matthew Lee. All right, Matt, it's wonderful to have you back on our podcast. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Glad to be here. It's been a few years, and it's always a joy to engage in this kind of dialogue, especially with the two of you.
Thank you so much for returning to our podcast. You are one of very few guests that we've interviewed more than once, and we're extremely excited to interview you today about the Global Flourishing Study. We're going to deep dive into that. So since we last spoke to you on this podcast, you and several other researchers have co-launched the Global Flourishing Study. It's a 5-year project that poses more than 100 questions to more than 200,000 people across 22 geographically and culturally diverse countries spanning all 6 populated continents. Can you please tell us about this study?
Yeah, I think it's really important that this is a longitudinal study. There's so many surveys out there that follow or ask a series of questions to a group of people, and then that's it. And so we're trying to follow them over time once a year for 5 years. And it raises the costs and the logistical nightmares exponentially when you try to do that, because people move around and, there's a variety of reasons why they might not want to participate again. And so tracking them, staying in touch with them, and then following up with them is really important to understand change over time and move us more in the direction of being able to make causal claims rather than here's some associations. And we don't know which came first because we have no time ordering, and we're not able to show how it changes over time or co-varies over time. So really important to do longitudinal research with the same group of people. And the other thing that I would say is, in many ways distinctive about this project is that we've adopted an open science framework. And so what that means is that anyone can access the data. And when we write our papers, we make the analytical code available to everyone. So you can change the code and see how that changes the results. The data are freely available. Nobody needs to pay a dime to access the data. And, we're pre-registering our studies before we do the analysis. So we're basically saying that we want to explore this, and this is our expectation, and then we see what happens. And if we get a result that's not what we anticipated, we're not changing things to try to torture the data until they confess. We're stuck with it. We've made a commitment, and we followed through on that commitment. So the open science approach is becoming more common, but it's pretty rare. And so between the longitudinal aspect and the open science approach, I think it's a pretty unique study. As you mentioned, on all of the populated continents, 22 countries and one territory, Hong Kong, that we've been following. And with that group of countries, because we have nationally representative samples in each country, we can almost generalize to humanity because that covers 64% of the Earth's population. So we're not saying we can make causal claims, and we're not saying we can generalize to all humanity, but we're getting closer than a lot of the previous work that's been done.
Sure. It's an amazing study. You have been talking about it so frequently now for, I don't know, the past many weeks, months, whatever it might be. But I do think it is worth mentioning, like what you're sharing here and you just described and are about to share highlights from, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say probably what's going to be the best study of human flourishing globally ever done, bar none.
Well, we're happy when other people say that about it. I would mention that it was really a collaborative effort. So Harvard and Baylor, particularly the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor, Gallup is the group that collected the data and really had a lot of wisdom and guidance about how to do something like this, which seems in some ways impossible, but they were able to do it. And then the Center for Open Science hosting the data archives and inviting people to pre-register and access the data. So that's a pretty unique collaboration. And I would say that our research team, it's got to have 40 or 50 scholars from all sorts of different disciplines.
It's incredible.
Just Baylor and Harvard. And then there's others outside of those two universities that have also collaborated with us. And then others are submitting their own pre-registrations, doing their own studies, publishing independent of us. And we welcome and encourage that as well.
From the same data set.
From using the same data. And I would also mention that we've organized some research satellites in the countries under study where we've, and Tim Lomas led this, where we've invited people who live in those countries to use the data and explore what's going on in their own country and make sense of it.
Wonderful.
Because a lot of our papers are doing a meta-analysis of all of the countries. And we've got tables where we show the results for the individual countries, but we don't have time to go into them. Many of these articles have, several hundred pages of supplemental tables that you can explore at your leisure, but we don't have the space to really devote to that. But having people who have local knowledge of the culture or the range of cultures that exist within a country allows them to make some more interesting statements that that draw upon their local knowledge. So there's a lot of different things going on here. And it's just snowballing as people find out about the data resource and then start using it themselves.
Well, so let's talk about the data itself and the data resource. And maybe we can start with just kind of the simplest question, which is like, what are you investigating, right? What is this study really measuring? What is that being informed by? Like, what will people learn about if they go to this data resource and consume this?
Yeah, so it starts with the understanding of flourishing, which is different than many other constructs, because flourishing is about our own subjective experience across multiple well-being domains, but also about the context in which we find ourselves. And so are we contributing to the flourishing of our context? Are our context contributing to our flourishing? So in addition to asking kind of the basic subjective individual flourishing measure, which is the Secure Flourishing Index, which was developed by Tyler and others at the Human Flourishing Program. This is a measure that looks at happiness and life satisfaction, meaning and purpose, physical and emotional health. See if I can remember all of them: character and virtue, close social relationships, financial and material stability. So those are kind of the foundational domains. It doesn't mean that flourishing is reducible to that, but any definition or understanding of flourishing would probably include those kinds of things. They seem to be 5 of them are ends in themselves. The financial and material stability items might be more of a means to an end. But in order to sustain the pursuit of these ends in themselves over time, it's helpful to have some level of physical safety and ability to pay your rent and, all that kind of stuff. So
Sure.
we think those are pretty important, but that's not the only thing. And so it's too long to remember, everything. So I've just written down a few examples of the
Awesome.
other kinds of variables that that are helping us to understand the context. So employment status, involvement in religious communities, whether a respondent feels like they belong in their country, and personal experience of forms of discrimination or how much they approve of the job that their national government is doing, the extent that they feel people in their country trust one another, and the list goes on. So you can certainly visit the Global Flourishing Studies website, globalflourishingstudy.com, to learn about all of the measures that were included. You can see the translation document, which is like 1,000 pages long, as the measure was translated into 46 different languages.
Wow.
You're free to use these survey items in your own surveys if you're conducting research, or explore the data set and crunch the numbers in different ways. But the point is, including something like, how much do people in my country trust each other, is really helpful to understand whether we're talking about flourishing or resilience. And so if my secure flourishing index scores are relatively high, but nobody trusts each other in my country, I would say, well, I've figured out how to be resilient or how to cope with a very bad context. But ultimately, flourishing requires us to understand the individual, the group, the society, and the planet as a whole. And that's why we're so excited to be able to link the data, certainly at the nation level. You can do a lot. You can get GDP and other kinds of measures at the national level. But we've got geographic locators for each respondent. And in the United States, for example, you could connect what you're learning about the people in the U.S. in the Global Flourishing Study with census data, maybe at the block group or the zip code or census tract or whatever level. So that requires a different layer of review. You have to have institutional review board approval from your university to dig into that kind of personal data. But once you get it, you can do a lot to link it to other data sets. So we're not saying that survey is the only way to understand flourishing. We're saying let's bring the survey results into dialogue with other things about the context and about individuals' lives, and really have a more complete picture of what flourishing as opposed to resilience or some of these other constructs might tell us.
So I want to ask about that, because you said it twice now, flourishing or resilience. That intrigues me, because I would generally think of flourishing as something that requires resilience frequently.
Well, I like that better. So let's go.
Oh, do you? Okay. Well, that's so. It was just interesting because.
Yeah.
Please go. Yeah.
We struggle to tell the story because for some people, flourishing and suffering are kind of opposite poles.
Sure.
If things are really going well, you're not depressed, but you're really joyful or whatever, then that makes sense. But oftentimes, depending on the season of life, we are grieving the loss of a loved one, or a lost job, or some opportunity that we thought we would have that didn't materialize. So I don't want to oppose suffering to flourishing, and I don't want to oppose resilience to flourishing, but there is a sense in which we're flourishing more if we're not the only flower blooming in the garden. Yeah. If we're sort of extracting our nutrients at the expense of others, and we're locked in this competitive world where we're forced to do that, I would want to use a word like resilience to describe that rather than flourishing, because the flourishing will involve giving. It's a virtuous form of well-being where we're not just pulling resources out of the soil for our own personal use, but we're actually sharing and helping others to flourish as well. Now, I would say that not everybody agrees with me or how my explanations change in the course of even one podcast. We're struggling with language because for some people, Flourishing is the opposite of suffering. And so yeah, I like this notion of wholeness amidst adversity, or one of our friends from Japan says it's the delicious life or the flavorful life, where you integrate the bitter and the sweet. So yes,
Who's that
all
person?
Her name is Mami Yanai, and she's been a member of our Flourishing network almost since the beginning. And it's a beautiful phrase. And she offers Japanese tea ceremonies. And that's one of the points of the tea ceremony, is the complexity of flavors when it's not just sugar all the time.
Right. Very cool. I was curious if you were going to bring up, I think we're going to try to have on the show, Dr. Oishi, and I'm forgetting the name of his book now, but it's, John, do you remember the title? And I thought you might go there. The something about the rich life. We're going to forget. Doesn't matter. But either way, this is all pointing to, I think, similar concepts that you're raising, Matt, and that it sounds like we're kind of teasing out here, which is that not only the conceptualization of flourishing, but the complexity or the richness or some of the affect of it, right, is where you're gonna find that complexity. And you just used the term that I heard you use in one of the webinars, and I've already forgotten it again. Adverse, it's something.
Wholeness amidst adversity.
Yes. Wonderful phrase. That's what I'm getting at. Wholeness amidst adversity. Yeah.
And the late Paul Wong, recently deceased Paul Wong, and my colleague Richard Cowden at the Human Flourishing Program wrote about sort of juxtaposing the deep life from the rich life. And the rich life is very low suffering and very high meaning. And the deep life is you still got the suffering, but you've got very high meaning. And the argument is, we suffer as human beings. Like, that's the first noble truth of the Buddha. Like, existence is suffering. So there is suffering, and so you're either going to try to escape that in various ways, and maybe in some ways there's been some psychological research on the difference between a happy life and a meaningful life, where the happiness is more about the takers and the meaning is more about the giving. But if you're not giving and you're not vulnerable in relationships characterized by love, then you're not really fully human. You're sort of living, an escapist kind of life. You're not, as I think it was Jung who said, you've got to send your roots all the way to hell in order to extend your branches to heaven. So not that we seek out suffering, masochistically, but it's there. And if we're in loving relationships, we make ourselves vulnerable to the suffering of the ones we love. So, one person said recently, you're only as happy as your saddest child. Well, one way to become happy then is just walk away from your child. But that's not love, because love has a kind of commitment. You're responsible in the sense of being able to respond. If you walked away from that. So anyway, I can tie myself up in knots around this, but I do think that people have said recently, in recent years, don't tell me I have to be resilient and then keep my circumstances absurd or unreasonable. We should be working on our circumstances so I don't have to be quite so resilient all the time. But of course, we do need resilience for flourishing. So I'm still struggling for the language to draw these distinctions. But I do like wholeness amidst adversity, or the delicious life.
Yeah, that was a great term when I first heard it. I'm glad you brought it back up. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful quote. It's a very sad quote. It's a beautiful quote. You're only as happy as your saddest child as well. So the book reference I have now remembered, it's Life in Three Dimensions. Is that the one you mean, Nick?
Yes, that is the one. Thank you, John. Yes.
Yeah. Fascinating book. Hopefully we'll talk about that on another podcast episode soon. One more thing on this point about resilience. This is a fascinating conversation, important point to make. But I take it, Matt, you mentioned at the start, what you're looking for ultimately in the global flourishing study is like causal relations between things that human beings do, ways they live, and how they can flourish. And one of the question here was, as Nick very well posed it, was why would resilience and flourishing be different things? Wouldn't flourishing require resilience? I take it one of the things you're looking for is when you have a set of responses to questions and it seems that people are living, the way they respond to questions, it seems they're not flourishing, yet they're coping very well with certain things in life. So you're like, well, it seems they're resilient but not flourishing. But in other cases, you might have a case where people offer responses which suggest they are flourishing, but they're also resilient despite certain circumstances in the environment in which they're living. And there you might say, well, one of the major reasons they seem to be flourishing is because they're resilient. So I take it you're looking for those kind of causal patterns here between character.
Yeah, I guess I would want to change the point I was making and just say maybe the way to think about flourishing is that we are not flourishing at the expense of others. By definition, that's not. So life is hard. It's full of adversity. Yeah. We seek out adversity if it's in service of our vocation. So there's nothing wrong with even leaning into this adversity or difficulties, or in many cases, putting ourselves at risk for lower physical health or maybe even death if we're risking our lives for some noble cause. So I don't want to give the impression that you can't flourish while you're leaning into the difficulties of life at all. But I do want to say that we would want to create contexts that make it more likely for everyone to flourish. And so that's partly what we're trying to understand with the Global Flourishing Study is what are those contexts? And one of the things that we've learned, and there's this report that we've released, the beta version recently for it, called Complete Wellbeing Throughout the World, Lessons from the First Wave of the Global Flourishing Study. And I was the lead author on this, and I've been grappling with this a bit. And we're making some changes to it, and we'll release it in a couple of weeks probably. But maybe by the time the podcast is posted, I don't know. But one of the things that was on my mind as I was thinking about what we've learned from the Global Flourishing Study and what we know from other data sets is whether countries have certain strengths. And because they're so good at their strengths, they have certain weaknesses. And so when we look at the ranking of the countries, by and large, that have the highest scores on the Secure Flourishing Index, one of the survey measures I mentioned earlier, a group of survey measures, they tend to be middle income countries, not exclusively, but there seems to be a negative correlation between GDP and the Secure Flourishing Index. So, what does that tell us? What does that mean? Well, those are two important data points. And there's others too, like the Environmental Performance Index, which is kind of an objective appraisal of how this country is either contributing positively or negatively to the environment. We could look at that for organizations or, cities or other groups as well. We could also look at the Global Peace Index or the Human Freedom Index. So there's all of these different metrics, and people care about all of them. And some countries appear at the top of one list and at the bottom of another list. And so what I think it tells us is that we have an opportunity to engage in cross-cultural dialogues to better understand the strengths of other countries and how they're contributing to these outcomes that we all care about, and then to share our strengths. What have we achieved as, in the United States, and what are our strengths? And then begin to ask the question, what would it look like if the human species gave more attention to harmonizing across these various outcomes that we all care about? And what kinds of sacrifices, might we have to make as individuals or as collectives or societies in order to achieve a greater harmony? There's a widespread agreement now that loneliness is a big problem in the United States, and maybe there's a crisis of meaning as well. And so when you start to look at a society that has done so well economically, but is lagging behind some of the other countries in the survey or on some of these other measures, you begin to wonder if maybe our systems have overemphasized economic growth. And maybe the human beings in those systems have been saying for some time now, we're looking for greater balance. And we can't quite figure out how to do that because the systems are pulling us in this way. So that's where I would say people can flourish up to a point in a context that is in some ways inherently dehumanizing. But it's not the fullness of flourishing. And maybe none of us attain that in our lifetimes, because it's all domains, all well-being domains across all levels. So it's an aspirational goal. Could we harmonize across these outcomes more thoughtfully, with greater awareness and greater generosity and love, so that we, might not be making some of these unwanted sacrifices and suffering in unnecessary ways. Suffering's always with us, but let's not suffer unnecessarily. So those are provocations, I guess.
Yeah,
this is fascinating.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
Can we just revisit one thing you said has emerged from the data, that there's a negative relationship between GDP and flourishing?
Well, yeah, and there's more, because as I was thinking about some of the things that I took for granted in my own life journey, of course I wanted financial material stability, and so I went to college and other things in part because of that. But I had also internalized a kind of long-term orientation. I'm going to delay gratification now so that I can be stable later in life. And that's an investment I'm making in my future. And then pursuing this largely individualistically. So if you look at GDP, a measure of individualism and a measure of long-term orientation, all three of those are negatively related to the Secure Flourishing Index. And I'm showing those who are watching the video. If you're listening to the podcast, you can't see it. I'm showing the scatter plot with the countries on these different measures, and thinking, all of the things that really oriented me early in my life, which I've now come to reject as fundamentally flawed, are all not the path to flourishing, at least as we understand it with the Secure Flourishing Index. Now, it might be the path to other forms of well-being, but not on that measure. So when I saw the data, I thought, well, I'm glad I've been moving away from that orientation for some time. I've invested more in relationships and less just in individual achievement. And it's a kind of natural thing when you hit 50 years old, you start to rethink.
Yeah, absolutely. But was one of them delaying gratification? One of those areas.
It's a long-term orientation, so it's a collection of questions around like planning for the future, partly delaying gratification, a whole range of things that orient you towards benefits later and less immediate joy and gratification in your life now.
Yeah, and was that one of the other areas that was negatively associated with flourishing?
Yeah.
See that? I mean, I like that you made the very nuanced point that on other well-being measures, it might be positively correlated with well-being, because that relates to research on, for example, the famous marshmallow study, where children were offered marshmallows now, and if you wait little while, you get a second one, but if you eat it now, you don't get a second one. And then studies following them up in later life showed negative correlations between well-being and career outcomes for those who did eat the marshmallows straight away as opposed to those who waited. And that led to a whole, growth of research on the benefits of delayed gratification for well-being. But you're suggesting that the first wave of data pulls that into question, at least based on the secure flourish measure.
I don't know that it would always call that into question. I mean, I'll just give you a couple examples just to make it a little bit more complicated. Japan scores the highest of the 22 countries in one territory on long-term orientation, and it scores last on the Secure Flourishing Index. But Indonesia scores third on long-term orientation and first on the Secure Flourishing Index. So so the correlation is negative. Overall, the relationship is negative. But what's going on with Indonesia? Number one on the Secure Flourishing Index and number three on long-term orientation. So it's not that it's always mutually exclusive. And this is really what the Global Flourishing Study is trying to get at as best we can. Given that we couldn't ask 1,000 questions, we could only ask around 100. What characteristics of societies are hanging together in certain ways to produce these kinds of patterns? And then what changes over time as those characteristics change? And because we can control for a lot, and because we have this statistical value called the E-value, where we can predict or we can estimate the impact of unmeasured confounders, we can almost begin to make causal arguments about this. But of course, we need other kinds of research to definitively make causal arguments. But it's a lot more clear. And so I should say that we're in the process of analyzing wave 2. Wave 3 is being collected. And so, pretty soon we'll be able to start making these kinds of arguments, not just what's related, but what comes first and what seems to co-vary over time and what seems to be a significant predictor of a lot of the things that people care about. And so, what happens when you get an outlier country that doesn't fit the pattern? Well, let's go study that. Why is that the case? But it's in some ways the Global Flourishing Study is going to raise more questions than it answers. I think it will shed some light, but I think it will get us very curious about doing qualitative research to really understand why we see these patterns. And that was beyond our budget.
Yeah, well, understandably, Japan's such an interesting example too. Like, how did they measure on individualism, or I assume it was juxtaposed with some sense of like communitarianism?
Yeah, so Japan scores about in the middle on individualism.
Okay.
What I would say about Japan's really interesting because it's number one on the peace index. So we value peace, and countries that are contributing to that can be said to be flourishing. It's also number one on motivation to succeed, and scores, let's see, in the top 10 at least on GDP, and also in the top 10 on the Environmental Performance Index. So scores very low on a lot of these subjective measures. And I end the report by talking about there's some communities in Japan where the young people have essentially disappeared. And so there's a fertility crisis in some of these communities. The residents have created mannequins to put in public places so that they can feel like there's other people there, because there's just like a population crater, demographic crater happening. So there's some really important questions that we can ask about how some of these things hang together that look very positive, but there's questions about some countries even continuing to exist unless they have a lot of immigration or something to offset the fertility crisis. It's essentially civilizational collapse is where things are headed. So, can you be said to be flourishing if your society is demographically imploding? These are questions that require us to look at the fullness of what we mean by flourishing and begin to ask the question, how are we harmonizing across these different outcomes? And in some ways, how have we created a society or number of societies that are essentially structured for something but not flourishing, structured for economic growth, or structured for some outcomes that some people want, but not really paying attention to the fullness of flourishing and not really structured for that.
Thank you, Matt. So these have been fascinating findings. Have there been any other findings from the first wave that have particularly struck you? Ones that you were surprised to see, or ones that you think are particularly important?
Yeah, I think, one finding that we've talked about a little bit, and it's gotten some traction in the media, is the importance of religious service attendance around the world. It doesn't seem to matter which religious tradition is dominant, but if you've got people either currently attending religion or they attended at age 12, there's still effects later in life with regard to the Secure Flourishing Index. So there's something about being present in religious communities that seems to be really important. And we're just beginning to unpack that. And again, as we have multiple waves of data, we can explore, what that means more directly. But, I think that came as a surprise to a lot of people. It didn't really surprise me that much.
Oh, really?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I'm not an expert on religion, but I co-authored a book called The Heart of Religion, where we talked about kind of love as the engine of empowerment to benevolently serve others. And so, the adage is that it's better to give than receive. And, that seems to be something that religious communities are promoting in some way for people around the world. So it seems to be a generalizable finding. Again, controlling for lots of things, and we'll have more to say about it after wave 2.
Good. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear more because it brings me back to episode 16 with Lisa Miller. I don't know if you and Lisa know each other. If not,
I listened to the episode. Yeah,
oh,
I remember
did.
it well.
So you might remember we were teasing out kind of the differences between religion and spirituality, right? And she mentioned how important it is to have a sense of meaning and buffers against suicidality and depression and all these things. To our point earlier, you might consider languishing or suffering or the opposite of flourishing, depending on your conceptualization. But she also mentioned that about 70% of people get their sense of meaning, that sense of spirituality or transcendence, from religion. And there's this other 30%, right? So I'm curious how that shows up in kind of other cultures, other communities, and if it is moderated by religious practice, right? Or it's really just connection to meaning or transcendence or something else.
Yeah, I think, probably Tyler is the expert on that, and he's written about that in other studies where he does find that it's religious service attendance itself that seems to have the strongest effect. So I don't want to go on record as the expert on that particular question, but I think that's an important research question for the team and for others using the data to really dig into. When we did a national survey of the United States for the book, The Heart of Religion, we found a very strong overlap between religion and spirituality. It wasn't that you certainly did have people who were spiritual and not religious, but the vast majority of people, like you're saying, 70% or so, would identify as both spiritual and religious. And so, when you have, population studies, what are the key ingredients? Is it like prayer and meditation? Is it actually attending services?
Right.
And so
the community aspect, the giving aspect. Yeah.
If I've understood, some of Tyler's work correctly, I think there's like a special bonus for being part of a community. And, maybe Robert Putnam would say it's the social capital. I remember some years ago, he wrote an article in a publication I was editing, and he asked the question, what's so darn special about church friends? It's like, church friendships seem to have more of a benefit than regular friendships. So why is that? He was just sort of musing and speculating on that. So I think you're raising an important question. I think we need to dig into the answer. And I think Tyler's addressed it in some of his other work, but I'm sorry, I'm not the expert on it.
No, it's all good. Yeah, just curious. It'll be fun to see what the future waves continue to tease out.
Yeah,
absolutely. Right. And this for listeners and viewers, this is Tyler Vanderweel that Matt keeps mentioning, director of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and one of the researchers involved in global flourishing study. One further question on this point about religion and spirituality, Matt. You mentioned that there was an impact even if someone went to religious services at the age of 12. So you found in the studies that if someone, say, regularly went up to a certain age, that it had long-term benefits to their well-being and health, or their feelings of flourishing? And if so, what age and how often did they have to go?
We just asked the question at age 12, were you getting services? So, we've asked this. I co-led a paper on showing love and care. And, we asked people about their experiences at age 12, and then that had a significant impact on how often they showed love and care to another later in life. So there's a whole series of, we call them childhood predictor papers. And if you go to the special collection for the Human Flourishing or the Global Flourishing Study on Nature and Springer's, this publisher called Nature Springer, that has a website with a lot of these papers from the first wave of data, you can find all these childhood predictor papers. And it's really striking how important it is, what we experience at childhood. I mean, I can give you a couple of examples from this complete well-being report that I'm holding here on some of the key factors that predicted flourishing, depending on what you experienced at age 12. So physical or sexual abuse had a strong negative impact on flourishing later in life. If you experience that at age 12, we would expect that. That's not terribly shocking. The financial status of the family, if you found it very difficult, found your financial status very difficult at age 12, that has strong negative effect. Feeling like an outsider in the family had a strong negative effect. And then on the positive side, having a very good or somewhat good relationship with father growing up. Age 12 religious service attendance at least once a week had a strong positive effect. Very good or somewhat good relationship with mother had a stronger effect than relationship with father. And then self-rated excellent health growing up had the strongest effect of all the predictors in childhood on the flourishing of respondents later in life when they filled out the survey.
Okay, I see. So
those are not perhaps surprising findings, but it does show that even when you're controlling for lots of other things, those kinds of variables, experiences you had at age 12, still have a sort of long-term effect on your life. Some of our respondents were in their 90s. And so looking back to when they were 12 years old, it still has an effect on what they're experiencing today.
Wow. So let's sort of, in our final question, let's think about anything practical you think we can draw out from this at this stage. So I know it's a very early stage of the research, but have there been any practical lessons you think we can draw or begin to draw from the first wave of the data about how?
Well, as I was just saying, how we treat our children is going to have lifelong effects on their flourishing around the world. And so it's good to invest in the flourishing of children and to support people raising children so that they can have that positive impact, so that people don't feel like outsiders when they're young, or they're not being abused and they're being cared for and loved by their parents. So that I think is obvious. What I would say is that the important takeaway for me at this stage, and we'll have more to say about as I said, almost causal relationships in the near future. But mainly, let's just get a dialogue started about flourishing and the fullness of flourishing and the things that we think that we ought to be harmonizing, more effectively at the societal level across the world. And so let's begin to explore the findings of this study, as well as the findings of many other studies, and begin to put the pieces together and then draw out the practical lessons from that. Because I think that, as I said, there's such strength and beauty in every country around the world. And let's learn to appreciate that, have dialogue about that, and then figure out how to apply that to our own context. So the more we understand about the flourishing of others, the more we can be enriched in our own flourishing And also we have something to share as well. And so I think that's the practical step of just creating possibilities for dialogue. People often talk about how polarized the world is or how polarized groups are within a single country. If we have created spaces that foster monologue rather than dialogue, it's very difficult to flourish together. And ultimately, flourishing is a collaboration. It's not something that we can really pursue on our own without being in dialogue and supporting each other.
Well, that is a beautiful message to finish a wonderful conversation on. Thank you so much, Matt. Well done for being part of this phenomenal research study, global flourishing study. We'll include links on it and some articles on it in our show notes. There have been a number of articles published in major media outlets, and including, in major academic journals recently, such as the New York Times and so on. So we'll also include a couple of links to those. Is there anything else you'd like to mention or plug in this podcast episode for our listeners or our viewers?
Well, I would just say, if you're a researcher, take advantage of the data, and help us understand, help the team understand what we can learn from it, and begin to design other studies to complement it.
Great.
Awesome.
Thanks again, Matt. This was really wonderful.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. So thank you, all of you, for listening and watching to another episode of Flourish FM. This has been Insights from the world's biggest study of human flourishing with Dr. Matthew Lee.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.